And now, please welcome to the stage, our Yale University class of 2024 valedictorian, Nathan Parker. The thunderous applause that filled the grand auditorium of Yale's campus seemed distant to my ears as I walked up to the podium. My hands were trembling, not because of the speech I was about to give. I had practiced it countless times, but because of what would come after. The real speech. The one that had been burning in my heart for the past decade. In the front row, among the distinguished faculty members and guests, sat Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the brilliant young professor of quantum physics who had taken the academic world by storm with her groundbreaking research. To the rest of the world, she was a rising star in theoretical physics, but to me, she was still just Sarah, the girl who had stolen my heart in 7th grade, and never really given it back. As I adjusted the microphone, my mind drifted back to that autumn day in 2014, when everything began. I was 12, a scrawny kid with thick-rimmed glasses and a mouthful of braces, newly transferred to Greenwich Middle School in Connecticut. The leaves were turning golden, and the air had that crisp feel that made everything seem possible. Sarah sat 2 rows ahead of me in Mrs. Henderson's English class. Even then, she stood out. Not because she was the prettiest girl in school, though, with her auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, she certainly could have been, but because of the way her whole face lit up whenever she talked about something she was passionate about. And Sarah was passionate about a lot of things: science, mathematics, the mysteries of the universe. I still remember the first time we really talked. It was during lunch break, and I had found a quiet spot behind the library to read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. Most kids our age wouldn't touch that book with a 10-foot pole, but I was fascinated by it, even though half the concepts went over my head. "You're reading it upside down," a voice said, making me jump. Sarah stood there, her own copy of the same book tucked under her arm, trying to suppress a smile. I looked down at my book in horror, realizing she was right. In my nervousness about being in a new school, I hadn't even noticed. My face burned red as I quickly flipped it around, wishing the ground would swallow me whole. But instead of laughing at me, Sarah simply sat down next to me and said, "The chapter you're on about black holes? It's my favorite. Want to discuss it together?" That was the beginning of our daily lunch meetings. We'd sit behind the library, sharing our packed lunches and talking about everything from quantum mechanics to our favorite Marvel movies. Sarah had this way of explaining complex scientific concepts that made them seem as simple as fairy tales. She'd use her sandwich to demonstrate the principles of gravity, or arrange her apple slices to show the structure of an atom. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself falling harder for her. It wasn't just her intelligence or her beauty, it was the way she treated everyone with kindness, the way she helped struggling students with their math homework, the way she stood up to bullies without ever resorting to meanness herself. She was like a supernova in human form, brilliant, warm, and impossible to ignore. By the time spring rolled around, I had written and rewritten the letter at least 100 times. Each version felt inadequate, unable to capture the depth of what I felt. How do you tell someone that they've changed the way you see the world? That because of them, you've started to notice the mathematics in music, the physics in a falling leaf, the poetry in a mathematical equation? The final version was simple, written on paper I had carefully chosen from the stationery store downtown. I had spent my entire savings on that single sheet with its subtle constellation pattern in the background. It seemed fitting after all, Sarah had taught me to love the stars. Dear Sarah, I know we're young, and maybe this will sound silly, but I think you're the most amazing person I've ever met. When you explain something, it's like the whole universe makes more sense. You make me want to understand everything: black holes, quantum mechanics, and especially the reason why my heart beats faster whenever you're around. I think what I'm trying to say is, I like you. Not just as a friend who shares my love for science, but as someone who makes every day better just by being in it. You don't have to feel the same way. I just wanted you to know that to me, you're as fascinating as all the mysteries of the cosmos we talk about. Nathan. I planned to give it to her after the spring science fair, where we were both presenting projects. Mine was about the mathematical patterns in nature inspired by all our conversations about how math was the language of the universe. I had worked harder on that project than anything else in my life, hoping to impress her. The day of the science fair arrived, and with it came an unexpected announcement: Sarah's family would be moving to California the following week. Her father, a renowned physicist himself, had accepted a position at Stanford University. The news hit me like a physical blow. I had waited too long, been too careful, too afraid. That afternoon, as Sarah stood on stage accepting first place for her project on quantum entanglement, I clutched the letter in my pocket, my heart pounding. This was it, my last chance. But as I watched her radiant smile as she held up her trophy, surrounded by congratulating teachers and classmates, I froze. What if the letter ruined everything? What if she thought it was stupid? What if it made our last few days together awkward and uncomfortable? The courage I had built up over months evaporated in seconds. As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, Tommy Fletcher, the class clown, chose that moment to play his latest prank. He had rigged up a water balloon system above the stage, and as Sarah stepped down, the balloons released. Without thinking, I rushed forward, pushing her out of the way. We both fell, but while Sarah remained dry, I ended up soaked from head to toe. The entire gymnasium erupted in laughter. As I lay there, water dripping from my glasses, I felt the letter in my pocket turning to soggy pulp. Sarah helped me up, concern in her eyes, but before she could say anything, her parents called her over to discuss their upcoming move. That was the last time I really spoke to her. The following week, she was gone, taking with her both my unspoken confession and a piece of my heart. The letter, destroyed by the water balloons, seemed like a sign from the universe. Perhaps some things were just meant to remain unsaid. As I watched her family's car drive away that final day, I made a promise to myself. If I ever got another chance, I wouldn't let fear hold me back. I would tell her exactly how I felt, regardless of the consequences. Little did I know that fate had a strange way of keeping promises, and that 10 years later, I would find myself standing on another stage, about to take the biggest risk of my life. But this time, I wouldn't let fear win. This time, I would speak my truth, even if it meant facing the laughter of the entire world. Standing at the podium now, my graduation speech cards neatly arranged before me, I could feel the weight of that decade-old promise. The letter I had written last night, an echo of the one lost to water balloons and teenage fears, felt heavy in my pocket. As I looked out at the sea of faces, my eyes found Sarah's, and for a moment, I was 12 years old again, lost in those intelligent green eyes that had first taught me to see the magic in the universe. The story was far from over. In fact, it was about to take a turn that neither 12-year-old Nathan nor anyone else could have predicted. But that's the thing about love stories, sometimes the most incredible chapters are the ones yet to be written. The decade between that water balloon incident and my graduation speech was like watching two stars moving in separate orbits, always in the same universe, but never quite crossing paths. Life has a funny way of keeping people connected, even when they're worlds apart, and Sarah and I were no exception. I followed her achievements from afar, first through social media, then through scientific journals and news articles. While I worked my way through high school in Connecticut, she was blazing through academic competitions in California. Sarah Mitchell became something of a legend in the science world, the teenage prodigy who published her first peer-reviewed paper at 16, exploring a novel approach to quantum computing. My own path wasn't exactly ordinary either. That project about mathematical patterns in nature, the one I had hoped would impress Sarah at the middle school science fair, had sparked something in me. I began seeing mathematics everywhere, in the spiral of shells, in the branching of trees, in the way crowds moved through city streets. By senior year of high school, I had developed an algorithm that could predict natural growth patterns, earning me a full scholarship to Yale. But it was during my freshman year at Yale when our paths almost converged again. I was sitting in the university library, surrounded by textbooks on advanced calculus, when I came across an article in Scientific American featuring Sarah's latest research. The photograph showed her in a Stanford laboratory, still with those same intelligent green eyes, but now with a confidence that made her seem to glow. She was working on a groundbreaking theory combining quantum mechanics with artificial intelligence. That night, I drafted an email to her. I spent hours writing and rewriting it, trying to find the perfect balance between casual and professional. Dear Sarah, I don't know if you remember me from Greenwich Middle School, but I just read about your work on quantum AI integration. Your approach to quantum state manipulation is brilliant. It reminded me of those lunch breaks when you used to explain quantum mechanics using sandwich ingredients. My cursor hovered over the send button for what felt like hours. In the end, I saved it to drafts, just like I had saved every other email I'd written to her over the years. Each one remained unsent, digital echoes of that waterlogged letter from 7th grade. Life continued its relentless forward motion. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make my own mark on the world. By junior year, I had published several papers on mathematical modeling of complex systems, earning recognition in my own right. Sometimes, at academic conferences, would hear people mention Sarah's name, and my heart would do that familiar skip it had perfected back in middle school. Then came the pivotal moment, during my senior year at Yale. The department was buzzing with excitement. They were bringing in a young professor who had revolutionized the field of quantum physics. I was in the middle of a study group when I heard her name, and the world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell will be joining our faculty next semester, my professor announced. She's doing groundbreaking work in quantum computing, and we're fortunate to have her. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. After 10 years of orbiting each other from a distance, our paths were finally about to cross again. But the timing couldn't have been more complicated. I was about to graduate, and she would be Dr. Mitchell, a faculty member. The same age gap that had seemed insignificant in middle school now felt like an unbridgeable chasm. The day she arrived on campus, I deliberately took the longest route between classes, both hoping and dreading that I might run into her. When I finally did see her, it was in the most unexpected way. I was giving a guest lecture to undergraduate students about complex systems mathematics, something I'd started doing in my senior year, when she slipped quietly into the back of the lecture hall. For a moment, I forgot what I was saying mid-sentence. She looked different, yet exactly the same. The auburn hair was shorter now, styled professionally, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had earned every accolade she'd received. But when our eyes met across the lecture hall, I saw a flicker of recognition, and maybe something else, a ghost of those shared lunches behind the library. After the lecture, I packed up my materials with trembling hands, knowing she was walking toward me. What do you say to someone who has unknowingly shaped the direction of your life? Someone who inspired your love for science even as they inadvertently taught you about heartache. That was an impressive lecture, she said, and her voice was just as I remembered it, warm and full of genuine curiosity. Your approach to modeling emergent behaviors is fascinating. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, I managed to reply, the formality of her title feeling strange on my tongue. I've followed your work on quantum computing. It's revolutionary. There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken words. I could see her studying my face, perhaps trying to reconcile the man standing before her with the boy she'd known a decade ago. Nathan, she said finally, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You still hold your chalk the same way, like you're afraid it might break. Just like that, the years seemed to collapse. We both laughed, and for a moment, we were just Nathan and Sarah again, sharing a joke about the mysteries of the universe. But reality quickly reasserted itself as a group of students approached her with questions about the upcoming semester. As I watched her walk away, I felt something shift inside me. The boy who had been too afraid to share his feelings had grown into a man who understood that some things were worth the risk of failure. The universe had given us another chance to cross paths, and this time, I wouldn't let fear hold me back. That night, as I sat down to write my valedictorian speech, I knew it would be more than just a recap of our college years. It would be a declaration of a truth that had remained constant through a decade of scientific discoveries and personal growth. A truth that had survived unanswered emails, unspoken words, and 10 years of watching her star rise from afar. I typed the first line: "They say that in quantum mechanics, particles that have once interacted remain connected, no matter how far apart they become." The speech would be my new letter, but this time, there would be no water balloons to stop me. This time, I would finally tell Sarah Mitchell exactly what she meant to me, even if it meant facing the laughter and judgment of everyone in that auditorium. After all, what was the worst that could happen? As it turned out, I had no idea just how unexpected the answer to that question would be. The universe, much like the quantum particles we had both dedicated our lives to studying, had been weaving connections I couldn't yet see. And in less than 24 hours, everything I thought I knew about our story would change forever. The morning of graduation dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect June day that New Haven seemed to specialize in. The historic buildings of Yale stood proud against the blue sky, their weathered stones holding centuries of stories. Today, they would witness one more. I had barely slept the night before, going over my speech again and again. The official version, safely loaded into the teleprompter, was everything you'd expect from a valedictorian address: reflections on our shared journey, hopes for the future, quotes from philosophers who had walked these same halls. But the real speech, the one that made my hands shake as I adjusted my tie, was folded in my pocket, written on the same constellation pattern paper I had used all those years ago. The graduation ceremony was being held in Woolsey Hall, its grand architecture a fitting backdrop for what I was about to do. As I sat among my fellow graduates, I could see Sarah in the faculty section, elegant in her academic robes. She was chatting with Professor Thompson from the physics department, completely unaware that she was about to become the focus of the most important moment of my life. Dean Morrison's introduction seemed to pass in a blur. Before I knew it, I was walking toward the podium, my heart thundering so loudly I was sure the microphone would pick it up. The familiar faces of my classmates looked up at me expectantly. In the front row, my parents beamed with pride, my mother already clutching a tissue. And there was Sarah, her attention now fully focused on the stage. I began with the official speech, my voice steadier than I expected as I spoke about our collective journey through Yale. I talked about the late nights in Sterling Memorial Library, the breakthrough moments in research labs, the friendships forged over countless cups of coffee at Book Trader Cafe. The audience responded exactly as expected, laughing at the right moments, nodding in recognition. Then came the pivot point. The moment where I would either continue with the safe, approved speech, or take the biggest risk of my life. Before I conclude, I said, deliberately moving away from the teleprompter, there's something else I need to say. A personal story about quantum entanglement, not just as a scientific principle, but as a metaphor for something I've learned about life and love. A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. In the faculty section, I saw Sarah sit up straighter, her professional composure giving way to visible curiosity. 10 years ago, in a middle school library in Greenwich, Connecticut, I met someone who changed the way I saw the universe. She taught me that mathematics wasn't just about numbers, but about finding patterns in chaos. That physics wasn't just about forces and particles, but about understanding the poetry written into the fabric of reality. I could see the moment Sarah realized I was talking about her. Her eyes widened, and her hand went to her throat, where I noticed with a jolt she was wearing a small pendant in the shape of an atom. We were just kids then, sharing sandwiches and dreams about unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos. I had written her a letter, trying to explain how she made even the most complex theories seem like beautiful stories. But thanks to an ill-timed prank involving water balloons, that letter never made it to her hands. The first laugh rippled through the audience, slightly uncertain, as people weren't sure if this was part of the planned speech. I saw Dean Morrison shift uncomfortably in his seat, but I pressed on. For 10 years, I've watched from afar as she became everything she dreamed of being: a brilliant scientist, an inspirational teacher, a person who makes the world better just by being in it. And for 10 years, I've carried the words I never got to say. More laughter now, some of it nervous, some of it amused. I could hear whispers spreading through the crowd as people began to realize this wasn't a metaphorical story. In the faculty section, several professors were looking between me and Sarah, who sat completely still, her face unreadable. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I pulled out the newly written letter from my pocket, "I know this isn't the conventional way to do this. I know there are probably 100 reasons why I shouldn't be standing here, telling the whole world that I've been in love with you since I was 12 years old. But quantum mechanics teaches us that observation changes reality, and I've spent too long being a passive observer in my own life." The laughter was louder now, scattered with a few gasps and whispers. Some people were recording on their phones, probably already thinking about how viral this would go. Sarah's face had flushed deep red, and several of her colleagues were staring at her openly. "You once taught me that in quantum physics, particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed. Well, I'm done with existing in this state of uncertainty. I'm done pretending that every achievement in my life hasn't been somehow shaped by that 12-year-old boy's desire to understand the world the way you did." The hall had erupted into a mixture of laughter, cheers, and shocked murmurs. Dean Morrison was halfway out of his seat, clearly torn between stopping me and letting this unprecedented moment play out. But I barely noticed any of it because Sarah had stood up. Her face was still flushed, but there was something in her expression I couldn't read. She was reaching into her academic robe, pulling something out of an inner pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to my letter as I continued. "So here I am, 10 years later, finally doing what I should have done that day in the middle school gymnasium. Sarah Mitchell, I." But I never got to finish that sentence, because Sarah had pulled out a piece of paper old, slightly yellowed, with a familiar constellation pattern barely visible in the auditorium lights. The laughter in the hall died instantly as she unfolded it with trembling hands. "I think," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "you might want to read this first." And that's when I saw it, my original letter, not destroyed by water balloons as I'd thought for all these years, somehow preserved and carried by Sarah Mitchell for an entire decade. The universe, it seemed, had one more quantum trick up its sleeve. The auditorium had fallen into a silence so complete you could hear the gentle whir of the air conditioning. Sarah's hands were steady now as she held the letter, though her voice trembled slightly as she began to speak. "You know, Nathan," she said, stepping into the aisle, "for a mathematician, you made a rather significant error in your calculations that day." She started walking toward the stage, my letter held carefully in her hands. "You assumed the water destroyed your letter. But you forgot one crucial variable: Tommy Fletcher's aim was terrible." A ripple of confused laughter spread through the audience, but I barely heard it. My entire world had narrowed to Sarah and that impossibly preserved piece of paper. "The water balloons," she continued, now at the foot of the stage, "hit you because you pushed me out of the way. But your letter?" She smiled, that same smile that had once explained quantum entanglement with sandwich pieces. "It fell out of your pocket before you moved. I picked it up while everyone was laughing about the water." My mind was reeling. All these years, I'd thought. "I read it that night," Sarah said, climbing the steps to the stage. "And I wanted to tell you, but then my dad got the Stanford offer, and everything happened so fast. I tried to find you at school the next day, but you were out sick. Then the day after that, and the day after that. By the time you came back, we were already packing to leave." She was standing next to me now, close enough that I could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes shone with unshed tears. "You want to know why I kept it all these years?" She unfolded the letter carefully, its constellation pattern faded but still visible. "Because it was the first time anyone had seen me, really seen me. Not as the science nerd, or the teacher's pet, or even the smart girl. You saw me as someone who made the universe make sense. Do you know how rare that is?" The audience had disappeared from me. The graduation ceremony, the shocked faces of the faculty, even the dean's increasingly concerned expression, none of it mattered. There was only Sarah, and the words I'd written a lifetime ago, somehow preserved against all odds. But that's not the only reason, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I kept it because every time I hit a wall in my research, every time I felt like giving up, I would read it again. This letter, written by a 12-year-old boy who thought I made the whole universe make more sense, it became my talisman. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Do you know how many times I almost contacted you? I followed your work too, Nathan. Every paper you published, every award you won. I watched you grow from that boy with the upside-down physics book into one of the most innovative mathematicians of our generation. But why? I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Why didn't you ever say anything? Sarah's smile turned wistful. The same reason you saved all those unsent emails. Fear. Pride. The growing weight of time and distance. Pick one. She looked down at the letter, then back at me. But mainly, it was because I needed to become the person you saw in me that day. The girl who could make the universe make sense. She reached into her robe again and pulled out another piece of paper, this one newer but made of the same constellation pattern stationery. I've been carrying 2 letters for the past month, ever since I knew you would be valedictorian. The old one, and this my response, written over and over through the years but never sent. I was going to give it to you after the ceremony. The hall was so quiet you could hear the paper rustling as she unfolded it. Would you like to know what it says? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Dear Nathan, she began reading, her voice clear and steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I've written this letter 1,000 times in my head. The first version was written the night I read your original letter, sitting in my bedroom surrounded by half-packed moving boxes. The second version was written during my first week at Stanford, when everything was new and scary, and I wished more than anything that I could talk to the boy who understood why I found beauty in equations. She paused, taking a deep breath. The third version was written when I saw your first published paper in the Journal of Mathematical Physics. The fourth when I watched your TED Talk on emerging patterns in chaos theory. The fifth when I accepted the position at Yale, knowing I would finally see you again. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The audience, the ceremony, the whole world seemed to fade away as Sarah continued. But every version has ended the same way. Perhaps it's fitting that we're both scientists, because this feels like a mathematical proof. No matter how many times I rework the variables, I always reach the same conclusion: you're the constant in my equation. The fixed point in my chaos theory. The particle I've remained entangled with across time and space. She folded both letters, the old and the new, and held them out to me. So perhaps it's time we both stopped being observers and started being participants in our own quantum experiment. The silence in the hall was absolute. Every person in that auditorium seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And in that moment, standing on that stage with a decade's worth of unspoken words hanging between us, I realized that sometimes the universe's greatest discoveries aren't made in laboratories or written in mathematical proofs. Sometimes, they're written in letters that survive water balloons and time itself, carried in pockets and hearts until the moment is finally right. They say that in quantum physics, the act of observation changes the outcome of an experiment. As I stood there on that stage, holding both letters in my trembling hands, my ancient confession and Sarah's decade-long response, I couldn't help but think about how true that was. The laughter that had filled the auditorium just minutes ago had transformed into something else entirely, a collective held breath, a shared moment of witnessing something extraordinary. I looked down at the letters, then back at Sarah. The morning sunlight streaming through Woolsey Hall's grand windows caught the tears on her cheeks, making them sparkle like the stars we'd spent so many hours discussing in that middle school library. Without thinking, I reached out and gently wiped one away. The simple gesture broke the spell of silence that had fallen over the hall. Someone in the audience sniffled loudly. I heard what sounded suspiciously like Professor Thompson, the stoic head of the physics department, blowing his nose. You know, I said, finding my voice at last, there's a theory in quantum mechanics about parallel universes. In some of them, I probably got the courage to give you that letter before the water balloons. In others, maybe we never met at all. I took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in mine. But I think I like this universe best. Sarah laughed through her tears. Why this one? Because in this universe, we both had the chance to grow into people worthy of each other's first impression. You became the brilliant scientist who makes the universe make sense to everyone, not just to a love-struck 12-year-old. And I gestured to the graduation ceremony around us. I learned that some equations are worth solving no matter how long they take. The dean cleared his throat behind us, probably wondering how to handle this unprecedented deviation from graduation protocol. But before he could say anything, Sarah stretched up on her tiptoes and kissed me. The hall erupted. The laughter that had once been mocking transformed into cheers and applause. I saw my mother crying openly now, my father giving me a thumbs up through his own tears. Even Dean Morrison had given up on maintaining decorum and was clapping along with everyone else. When we finally broke apart, Sarah pressed her forehead against mine and whispered, "You were wrong about one thing in your speech earlier." "What's that?" "You said you were done existing in a state of uncertainty." She smiled that brilliant smile that had first captured my heart a decade ago. But uncertainty is what makes quantum mechanics beautiful. It's what makes life beautiful. The only difference is now we can face that uncertainty together. As if to prove her point, she turned to address the shocked but delighted audience. I suppose this is as good a time as any to announce that I've just received a grant to establish a new quantum computing research center here at Yale. She squeezed my hand. And I happen to know a brilliant mathematician who might be interested in combining his work on pattern recognition with quantum theory. I couldn't help but laugh. "Dr. Mitchell, are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a partnership," she corrected, her eyes twinkling. "In research and in life. After all, we've already proved we work well together. Even if it took us 10 years to publish our results." Later that evening, long after the ceremony had ended and the excitement had died down, Sarah and I found ourselves back in the spot where our paths had crossed again, the lecture hall where I'd first seen her after 10 years. The room was dark except for the faint glow of emergency exits, but it felt right somehow. Like coming full circle. We sat in the front row, shoulders touching, reading and rereading our letters. The old paper was soft with age and handling, the constellation pattern barely visible now, but the words were as clear as ever. 2 letters, written a decade apart, telling the same story from different sides of time. "You know what this reminds me of?" Sarah said, holding both letters up to the dim light. "Binary stars." "How so?" 2 stars, orbiting each other through space. Sometimes they look like they're far apart, but they're always connected by gravity, always moving in relation to each other. And eventually, she laced her fingers through mine. Eventually, they find their way back together. I thought about all the times I'd almost reached out over the years, all the drafts of emails and aborted phone calls. "Do you regret that it took us so long?" Sarah shook her head. "Every moment led us here. Besides," she added with a grin, "I think we just proved that time is relative. We stayed there until dawn, talking about everything and nothing. About quantum mechanics and mathematics, about the years we'd missed and the years stretching ahead of us. About how sometimes the most complex equations have the simplest solutions, and how love, like quantum entanglement, doesn't care about time or distance." As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, painting the lecture hall in shades of gold, Sarah pulled out one more piece of paper, the same constellation pattern, but brand new. "What's that?" I asked. "A new letter," she said, uncapping her pen. "I think it's time we started writing our story in the present tense. Together, we began to write on that star-scattered paper, our words mixing together just as our lives had finally done. And above us, in the brightening sky, two stars completed their long orbit and finally, beautifully, became one. 6 months later. The Quantum Computing Research Center's inaugural symposium was packed with academics and students alike. As I watched Sarah take the stage to present our first joint paper, I couldn't help but smile at the title on the screen behind her. Quantum Entanglement and Pattern Recognition, a 10-year study in parallel processing. And there, in the footnotes, was a dedication that made my heart skip just as it had in that middle school library. To the boy who read physics books upside down, and the girl who helped him find his orientation in the universe. Some experiments take time, but the results are worth the wait. The audience laughed at the dedication, but this time, it was a laugh of understanding. Because sometimes, the greatest discoveries in science and in life come not from careful observation, but from having the courage to become part of the experiment yourself. As Sarah launched into her presentation, her green eyes finding mine in the crowd, I touched the constellation pattern paper in my pocket where we'd written our latest letter together. Some people say that science and romance don't mix. But Sarah and I had proved that the most beautiful equations are the ones written by heart, and the most important experiments are the ones where you risk everything to test a hypothesis you've held for 10 years. After all, in both quantum physics and love, the act of observation changes everything. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to finally open your eyes and see what's been there all along.